What's up, guys? Welcome to this edition of a Funko Popcast. I am DK Wrestler.
And I'm MD Shady.
And in today's podcast, it is titled The Best of Warner Brothers. Yes, we're talking all about Warner Brothers, whether it's movies or possibly also shows that were made by Warner Brothers. Of course, a few weeks back, I believe we did a Best of Disney podcast to celebrate the fact that Disney was celebrating 100 years. And that is the same case with Warner Brothers. This year is Warner Brothers' 100th anniversary. We've been seeing a lot of WB 100 merchandise, whether it's, of course, Funko Pops or even like Hot Wheels or other collectibles. We've been seeing a lot of Warner Brothers 100 stuff. So we thought that the same way that we talked about in the Disney podcast is showcasing a bunch of Disney movies or shows in case we never do a podcast on them, is the same thing with the Warner Brothers licensor. And the one thing I do want to do a disclaimer on, in case you were wondering, is that we are not including anything with the new acquisition of Cartoon Network, which is now a Warner Brothers property, but that's because we'll probably at some point do a Cartoon Network-esque podcast, and I'm sure Nickelodeon at some point too, which isn't owned by Warner Brothers, but I thought I would mention that also. But nonetheless, I mean, MD, your thoughts on Warner Brothers? I know they've done a lot of cool movies, and especially I know that there's some awesome TV shows that we'll definitely get into, especially in the first section of the pod.
Yeah, I mean, just like Disney, of course, celebrating 100 years, Warner Brothers is a powerhouse when it comes to movies and TV shows. They own a lot of different things, and it's pretty crazy. It's super nostalgic, too, when you think of, like, popping a VHS tape into a VCR player and seeing that Warner Bros. Logo come up, whether you're watching shows like Scooby-Doo, for example. You see that Warner Bros. Logo, and that goes with a lot of different movies that we're going to talk about here, of course, and even TV shows and movies that don't have Funko Pops that we'll probably end up being talking about. There's just a lot of stuff. And of course, one of their biggest things is DC, which has a huge fan base. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of DC, but DC's amazing nonetheless. So yeah, Warner Brothers is great. And they kind of do a little bit more than Disney, but at the same time, kind of not. But their range kind of varies a lot more.
All right, so how we're going to do this, just like the Disney podcast from a couple weeks ago, we're dividing these into decades, except actually the first decade is multiples because a lot of the properties either don't have Funko Pops or there's a lot that like we don't really know of, so we aren't really going to mention. However, if there are some that we don't mention, definitely mention it in the comment section below, especially if we miss some, because of course, 100 years of Warner Brothers, we're not going to be able to cover everything that's happened within the last 100 years. But nonetheless, we're going to be kicking off with the very first category, which is from the 1930s all the way until the 1970s. So we got a lot of decades to go through. The list that we have here, whether they have Funko Pops or not, we got Moby Dick, The Wizard of Oz, Gilligan's Island, The Flintstones, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, The Exorcist, Superman, and the OG Mad Max. So I guess the first one I'll mention about is, of course, The Wizard of Oz. That's kind of the oldest, biggest property I think a lot of people can think of off the top of their heads. I mean, such a classic movie, and especially being one of the first ever colored movies that were made. The Flintstones is a huge powerhouse of a franchise, especially when it comes to the Funko Pops, whether it is just your regular lineup or mashups, or especially recently this year, the Funko NFTs. There was a Flintstones lineup. And I guess you can mention also throughout Hanna-Barbera is a huge thing with the Warner Brothers licensing. And then the Jetsons, that goes a long way. And especially Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo, what an awesome series. A lot of people love Scooby-Doo, whether it is the main characters or even the villains are very memorable. Also, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. This is the one with Gene Wilder in it. This is a great movie. And the Funko Pops, they didn't really do too much. However, the most expensive Funko Pop of all time is actually in this lineup, that being the Golden Ticket 2-pack that sold last year, or actually I think at some point this year as of the recording of this podcast, for $210,000. So that's crazy history being made as terms to Funko. And then when we go to horror movies like The Exorcist, which seems to be like one of the very first horror movies that were ever done, that OG Superman movie with Christopher Reeves is a really cool movie. And then Mad Max, I don't know too much of, besides of course Funko did Mad Max Fury Road Funko Pops a few years back, but I don't think they ever did any for the OG movie. And especially for the Warner Brothers 100 set, they just announced pops for Mad Max. I think it's called The Road Warrior, which I'm not sure if that's an older movie or it's something that's coming out very soon for Mad Max.
All right, so I guess I will also start off with The Wizard of Oz, an amazing movie, one of my favorites. I wish I owned the pops for this because they're great, but they are pretty much mega grails at this point, a lot of them. But those pops are amazing. Gilligan's Island, I remember watching a bit of that when I was younger, and it's cool that we do have Funko Pops for Gilligan's Island nowadays. The Flintstones, that is a set that I collect, as well as the Jetsons and Scooby-Doo for that matter. So yeah, Hanna-Barbera stuff, of course, there's a ton. A favorite from Funko is, of course, Huckleberry Hound. Those pops, you see a lot of different color variants and different variants, whether they're holding like Funko Shop bags, stuff like that. So Hanna-Barbera, I mean, awesome. I feel like you can't really hate on Hanna-Barbera. There might be shows that you might not like, but altogether, Hanna-Barbera is an awesome kind of cartoon property. And then we have Scooby-Doo, one of my favorites of all time. I love all of the Scooby-Doo stuff, whether it's the animated series, the movies, anything like that. Scooby-Doo is awesome. Love collecting anything that it comes to Scooby-Doo. And then Looney Tunes as well. I love Looney Tunes. And there's a bunch of really awesome Funko Pops and some that are like super grails, like let's say Speedy Gonzales, as well as the 2-pack of Bugs Bunny, as well as Dr. Hyde, I believe it is, or Jekyll. I don't remember how it is, but that's a crazy 2-pack, which is one of my most wanted grails. And then Willy Wonka, again, one of my favorite movies of all time. The Pops are really cool as well. I do own a few of the Pops, but I'm looking towards finishing that collection. The Exorcist, a movie that absolutely scared me as a kid and basically made me hate a lot of scary movies, was because I watched The Exorcist not realizing what it was. And then Superman, that's a great movie. The original Superman is awesome. And then Mad Max is really cool as well. I remember playing the game on the original NES. I believe that was a decent game, and I haven't seen it in so long, so I don't really remember anything about it, but it does have a huge fan base.
All right, so now moving over to the 1980s, which Warner Brothers was definitely a huge powerhouse when it came to a lot of movies and TV series for the 1980s. So Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street as terms to horror movies. Oh, and I guess also The Shining I've listed down. The National Lampoon's Vacation series, whether it's National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, they had the Vegas Vacation. Of course, one of MD's favorite things, Gremlins, was made in the 1980s. The Goonies, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Little Shop of Horrors, The Lost Boys, Beetlejuice, the 1989 Batman movie, which is regarded as one of, if not like the greatest Batman movie. Well, I wouldn't say it's the greatest Batman movie, but a lot of people's favorite Batman movies. I'll get into what I think is the best Batman movie later on in this podcast. And then 2 licensors that I wanted to mention because they don't have pops. We got ourselves The Outsiders and then The Never Ending Story. Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and The Shining. I'll mention all those. Those are some pretty big horror movies that kind of stood the test of time. And there isn't really too much Funko Pops as terms to the majority of this, concerning that with Friday the 13th, it's just Jason Voorhees. And then with Nightmare on Elm Street, it's just Freddy Krueger, which is really all you need, even though there are characters, obviously, that could be made. The Shining has a huge lineup of Pops. And one thing I did really enjoy about the Shining Pops that I remember those being like the first Funko Pops, at least I can think of off the top of my head, that added like those cool details as terms to the box. Like I think there's like a blood splatter or some sort of like maybe like a handprint like kind of covered in blood going across the window there. So I really like those details in terms of the Pops. Gremlins, I mean, that very first movie is really awesome. I mean, from time to time I will watch Gremlins, and there is a huge lineup as terms to Gremlins, and of course Gremlins 2, which we'll get into when we get into the 90s section. The Goonies, once again, we just recently got a huge wave of new Goonies Pops with characters that we may have seen before, like Sloth, who got a couple of new variants, but then there's also characters that never been made, like I believe like was it Brand or something like that. But nonetheless, I mean, that movie is awesome. Pee-wee's Big Adventure, I mean, rest in peace Pee-wee Herman. I know he recently passed away, so it kind of sucks that we have to mention about that on the pod now, but there are a couple of Pee-wee Herman Funko Pops. Little Shop of Horrors I don't know too much about, and same with The Lost Boys. But Beetlejuice, once again, is a pretty big movie franchise, especially with, I believe, a second movie coming out within the next year or two, which is cool. And I believe is it Michael Keaton, I think, that was Beetlejuice. Okay, and he's reprising his role in that movie also, which is awesome. The Batman 89 movie, I mean, that is a great movie when you have, once again, Michael Keaton playing as Batman. You have Jack Nicholson as the Joker. Without that movie, I don't think we get the other Batman movies that we get later on down the line, which we will be talking about in the podcast, especially the one that I think is the greatest Batman movie of all time. And then then when it comes to the non-Funko Pop related movies, I mean, Outsiders is so good. If you have not seen The Outsiders, I definitely recommend it. And then Neverending Story, also another movie that is very memorable, especially like recently, like Stranger Things kind of paid homage to Neverending Story with like the song in season 3. So that was pretty cool. But nonetheless, I mean, the 80s was pretty massive for Warner Brothers.
So starting off with Friday the 13th and The Nightmare on Elm Street, two really great movies, of course, and we have seen many pops, whether it comes to Freddy or Jason, and usually the pops are pretty dang good for those movies as well. National Lampoon's Vacation, and we do have a couple different pops for that, and they're pretty decent as well. And then moving on to one of my favorite movie series of all time with Gremlins. The first movie is so good. I've watched it so many times. Of course, I collect a ton of Gremlins products and all of the Funko Pops as well. I pretty much have most of them. I don't have the original chases, but maybe one day. Then we have The Goonies. Again, such a classic movie. There's the OG set of Pops and there's the new set of Pops, and both sets are really, really good. I like both sets a lot. And yeah, that movie is just so good. It's basically for anybody. Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Of course, we have seen a couple of different Pee-wee pops, and they're pretty dang cool. I mean, of course, Pee-wee himself, and then Cherry, I believe, is the like chair character's name. I can't remember off the top of my head. Little Shop of Horrors. That's a pretty cool movie. I haven't really seen all of it, so I'm definitely gonna have to check it out again. The Lost Boys, amazing movie as well. And then Beetlejuice is unbelievable. I feel like most people have seen Beetlejuice, and if you haven't, definitely watch it. The pops, I feel like there probably could be more pops for Beetlejuice. We have seen quite a few, but I feel like we could get a lot more different cool ones. Batman 89, of course, we have seen a bunch of pops for Batman 89, like DK said. One of, if not the best Batman movie, and arguably so. I mean, it's so good. And the actors in that are just amazing. The Outsiders as well. Wish we had pops for this too, because The Outsiders is, again, so classic. If you haven't watched The Outsiders, I suggest reading the book first and then watching the movie, because there's a little bit of differences between the movie and the book, just like anytime you have a movie made from a book. And then The Never-Ending Story. That's a really cool movie as well. And I believe that Never-Ending Story has 3 different movies, 1, 2, and 3, if I'm not mistaken. But starting off with the first one, yeah, so cool. And like DK said, with Stranger Things kind of throwing a nod to the Never-Ending Story because, of course, the 80s.
And now we're moving over to the 1990s, which actually there isn't as much as there is listed for the 80s, but still some pretty memorable movies, especially ones that I definitely watched for sure. First off, I think it was right in 1990. It is Gremlins 2, Batman Returns, Dumb and Dumber, Batman Forever, Space Jam, Batman and Robin, The Matrix, The Iron Giant, and then a movie that actually did not get Funko Pops, or at least yet, because there is going to be a second movie coming out. That movie is Twister. All right, so Gremlins 2, I mean, some people can mention that Gremlins 2 is like just as good as number 1, or some people actually mention how it's not as close as being good as the first one. I remember enjoying the second one, and I can't exactly remember like the whole plot of the second one. I'm sure MD can mention it because he has a far better memory than I do. But nonetheless, as far as I remember, I enjoyed number 2 as well as I enjoyed number 1. Batman Returns, that one is really cool because that is, I think it's still Michael Keaton as Batman, but I believe this is the one where we had Danny DeVito as the Penguin, which is really cool. We did get the Penguin in Duck Cart as a Funko Pop for San Diego Comic-Con last year, which was really cool. Dumb and Dumber is one of the best comedy movies I have ever seen. Jim Carrey and I believe Jeff Daniels. It's so good, and especially the lineup they did recently with Funko Pops. Like, they basically perfected that lineup with exactly what we should. There could be a couple of more. Unfortunately, the second movie compared to the first one was complete dog. But the first movie is just such a classic. And then we got Batman Forever, which is the 1995 Batman that now I believe it is Val Kilmer as Batman. And then this is where, speaking of Jim Carrey, is the Riddler, and Tommy Lee Jones is Two-Face. And then I can't remember. I think the guy who plays Robin is in this movie also. That one, I can't, for some reason, I don't really remember that one too much. Space Jam, what a classic movie. We did get Space Jam: A New Legacy within the last couple of years, but the original Space Jam, which has Funko Pops in the lineup is really cool. And I do think by a long shot, Space Jam 1 was better than Space Jam A New Legacy. Batman and Robin, I don't even know if I actually mentioned Batman and Robin while going through this. I think I went from Space Jam to Matrix without talking about Batman and Robin. But Batman and Robin is one of those movies where a lot of people crap on it, but I don't, considering that it technically would have been the first Batman movie released after I was born. I was born in 96. This movie released, I believe, 97, 98, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously, I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger playing as Mr. Freeze. And then you have actually George Clooney as Batman in this case. And there's the whole joke about like the bat nipples because of the suit. So that's kind of a thing to remember about for some reason. But I don't know. I'm going to have to watch it again. But it is, I believe, rated a 7% on Rotten Tomatoes. The Matrix, I've only seen a couple of times. But of course, you know that famous scene of like the whole dodging the bullet bend. They did it as an NFT Funko Pop, and that was insane. The Iron Giant is such an underrated classic that I don't think a lot of people really talk about. There were two Funko Pops back in the day when like the movies lineup first started, I believe. And then only recently we started getting products again with the Funko Soda figure. That's a 3-liter figure. So I kind of hope that for some reason, maybe in the next couple of years, I believe that we're approaching the anniversary of Iron Giant, that maybe we can get a couple of more pops out of the movie for some reason. And then Twister. Twister is a great movie. And funny enough, I guess I'll mention the story is that in our area where we lived, when Twister was playing in theaters, our local drive-in actually had a tornado hit, or basically a little twister, and like knocked down the movie screen that was playing Twister. So that's always an amazing story to tell about Twister. Like literally the week that it came out. I hope we do get OG Twister Pops when the new movie comes out, which I believe actually is called Twisters with an S at the end.
All right, so starting off with Gremlins 2. Yeah, I think that a lot of people regard this as the better Gremlins movie. And I feel like the reason for that is the diversity in the Gremlins themselves. And if you guys don't know, the reason for that is because the fabricator for the puppets, Warner Bros., I guess, essentially asked him, like, hey, we want you to do the puppets again for Gremlins 2. And he said no. They said, well, why? And he said, because I don't want to make the same puppet a million times again, like in the first movie. So they basically came to an agreement where he would make like these different gremlins that aren't all the same, and that's when you get to see your Greta, you get to see your spider gremlin, your bat gremlin, all the different cool gremlins. Daffy, so cool. I love the movie. DK mentioned about the story. Basically, the main character gets Gizmo again and brings him to the workplace, and of course he gets water on him, and then there's more gremlins, and then he ends up with Daffy, I believe, is the gremlin that he actually ends up with when he goes to save Gizmo, and he ends up with that gremlin. And then, of course, everything gets wild because these gremlins are arguably more powerful than the ones in Gremlins 1. But we already talked about Gremlins, so let's move on to Batman Returns. Amazing movie again. I don't really hate any Batman movie, to be honest. I feel like you kind of just have to take them with a grain of salt and just enjoy it. Batman Returns, there's a bunch of Funko Pops for as well. Dumb and Dumber, of course, is hilarious. Like DK said, there probably could be more pops in this lineup, but they did a really good job with the pops that they gave us. It's basically everything we wanted to see. And then I guess I'll talk about Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, all in the same thing. Batman and Robin, I know people don't really like that movie. I personally love that movie. I think it's awesome. I don't know why, but I just love it. And of course, like Poison Ivy, so great. Then we have Space Jam. I mean, this is such a cool movie, and this movie screams the 90s. Of course, you got the Looney Tunes and then Michael Jordan. So amazing, such a great movie, and I'm happy that we got to see a second movie, even though it's not exactly what people wanted, but it's still really cool. Then The Matrix, of course, we do have a bunch of pops for The Matrix. That is one of those like cult classic movies at this point, and of course, there's so many memorable scenes from The Matrix that how could it not be? The Iron Giant, just like DK said, is super underrated. What a great movie. I haven't watched it since I was so young, so I'm gonna have to go back and watch it, but I remember always wanting to watch it, especially when I was at a certain friend's house. I'd always watch it there. And then the last one for the 90s with Twister. Yeah, like DK said, the story about our local drive-in where the Twister hit, and my mom was actually there when it hit, and I guess, yeah, it was pretty dang crazy, and it's just so coincidental that that could happen, and also like so scary. Could you imagine being there when that happens while you're watching this movie that's about exactly that? So I don't know, maybe we will see pops for Twisters, but realistically, besides human pops, what are they going to do? Just a tornado Funko Pop? I don't know.
So let's move over to the 2000s, which there's definitely a decent list to talk about. May even talk about all of these that are listed here. So the very first one I had to write for the 2000s is number 1 to 6 for the Harry Potter movies, followed by the Lord of the Rings series, the live action Scooby Doo from 2002, Elf, Batman Begins, Supernatural, V for Vendetta, 300, The Big Bang Theory, The Dark Knight, Watchmen, The Hangover, The Polar Express, and The Blind Side. So starting off with Harry Potter, I mean, oh my God. Funko makes so many Harry Potter pops, and I don't want to go into too much description considering that we actually do have a all Harry Potter podcast on our channel that I did with our good friend Robbie D, who from time to time will be like a special guest co-host of the podcast. The Harry Potter series is cool. There are some that are like meh, but then there are some great ones I've mentioned on that podcast, like what my favorite ones are. The Lord of the Rings series, I haven't watched too much. I may have watched once or twice all 3 of the movies. And yeah, it's ridiculous how long those movies are. Like, those are like, I think even longer than Star Wars movies. And Star Wars takes a little bit to get through. The live action Scooby Doo from 2002 is like kind of my first memory of Scooby Doo, even before watching like the 60s animation series we talked about earlier, seeing the live action one with like, I believe it's Matthew Lillard is his name, who plays Shaggy. That's really cool. So hopefully maybe at some point we do get Funko Pops for that. It'd be really cool to see how they would pull off the live action Scooby-Doo in pop form. Elf is what I consider my second favorite Christmas movie of all time. The first, in case you were wondering, is Jingle All the Way. Elf is great. Actually, originally, we were going to plan on having Elf as its own separate podcast, but then the idea of let's do a Warner Brothers 100 podcast instead, that was a little bit a better idea. So that not only can we acknowledge Elf, but a lot of the Warner Brothers properties that may never get their own podcast here on the channel. But Elf is such a great movie. It's such a cool concept also. It's actually, I believe, the first movie directed by Jon Favreau, who later on would do Iron Man for the MCU and kick off that, and would now today is very well known for making amazing Star Wars content, whether it is The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, even having his own take alongside Dave Filoni for the Ahsoka series that came out. Speaking of first time ever, I believe Elf was the first ever lead role that Will Ferrell ever got in a movie. So doing that, like, would Will Ferrell be as popular as he is today had he not done Elf? And I think even Will Ferrell had mentioned in like interviews that like he heard about the possibility of an Elf 2 and he declined it because of how special this movie was, that it shouldn't have been duplicated. And I mean, we've seen a lot of duplicates for Warner Brothers properties and see how they turned out, especially what I mentioned about Dumb and Dumber earlier. It probably would have been the same thing for Elf, not gonna lie. Batman Begins, the beginning of the trilogy made by Christopher Nolan, I believe the director is, and that was a great movie. Supernatural is a series I've only seen a couple of episodes of, but I thought I'd mention it because I feel like that's one of those things where I don't want to leave it out, or as people are gonna be like, why didn't you mention Supernatural? And there was a decent amount of pops back in the day for that. V for Vendetta, once again, one of those underrated movies that not a lot of people talk about. There was one Funko Pop that came out back in the day for V for Vendetta, and it would be really cool maybe if they like redid it, but in like a VHS, or not a VHS cover, but I guess like a, and I don't want to say a movie poster either, because that requires them to make like the 6-inch pop and how they do with the movie posters, but you can't call it VHS because it came out in 06 when I think VHS was pretty much done. 300, I mean, this is Sparta. That's pretty much how you would know of 300. They just announced a new wave of 300 pops, or actually the first wave of 300 pops, because they only had the Leonidas from the OG movies wave for the longest time. And now they have this huge new wave. Big Bang Theory, probably one of the most popular modern day TV series that Warner Brothers has done. I mean, they have waves upon waves of Funko Pops, lots of seasons, ending just a couple of years ago, I believe, finally, after running since 2007. What a great show. And I mean, there's a lot of fan favorite characters, especially Sheldon Cooper has to be like the most fan favorite character. The Dark Knight, this is what I'm mentioning by the best Batman movie that Warner Brothers has done, and probably the best DC Comics film that has ever been done. Heath Ledger as the Joker is easily, in my opinion, the best Joker that has ever been done as terms of the TV series or the movies. I mean, No disrespect to, let's say, Caesar Romero, I think it is, from the TV series, and Jack Nicholson for 89. And then especially later on, we do get to see Joaquin Phoenix for the Joker 2019 movie. But there's something about Heath Ledger that just, he is Joker. And then, like, everything that you see of Joker, even in comic books, Heath Ledger perfected it. And it's so sad to see that he had passed away just before the release of the movie. That Dark Knight movie just stands the test of time, and not only maybe is the greatest DC film, but one of the greatest films like ever made, period. Whether it's Warner Brothers, Disney, Marvel, Star Wars, it doesn't matter. Dark Knight, one of the greatest films ever made. Watchmen, once again, like just like V for Vendetta, one of those underrated films that not a lot of people talk about. And it's also one of those things that people forget that this is actually a DC Comics property. So it's weird that Funko's never really, like, they did the original wave, but it would be really cool to see some new Watchmen pops, especially they did the TV series for HBO Max. I don't know why they didn't do pops then. The Hangover, what a hilarious movie, a hilarious trilogy of movies. They did one Funko Pop with Zach Galifianakis' character holding the baby. Polar Express is a movie that for some reason I never really get time to watch during like the Christmas holidays and when I'm binge watching movies, but it is a great movie. I mean, Tom Hanks playing like the train conductor, like so awesome. And then The Blind Side, based off of a true story. I know that actually, like, the guy that it was based off of kind of like mentioned a few things that were like untrue about the movie. And nonetheless, though, like the overall movie and how it was done was very great to see.
All right, so starting off with the Harry Potter films, so good. I actually haven't watched them all. I know that's kind of a hot take, but I have seen most of them. I just haven't gotten around to seeing like the last couple, I believe, but they're so good. I mean, you can't really hate on Harry Potter. One movie that I do hate on, though, is The Lord of the Rings. All jokes aside, I don't actually hate The Lord of the Rings, but because I'm such a big Star Wars fan, there was a time where I would say, yeah, you're just sitting around for 3 hours watching people walk, when of course I know that that's not realistic, and I am going to have to go back and rewatch The Lord of the Rings. Of course, these Scooby-Doo movies, really good. I know that some people don't like them too much, but I think they're great. I actually just recently rewatched both of them not too long ago, and they still hold up. I mean, Matthew Lillard is awesome as Shaggy, and of course he does voice Shaggy in most of the animated series stuff as well. Then we have Elf, and I really don't understand how people hate on Elf. Some people say, oh, it's so childish, blah, blah, blah. I don't really think so. It's a hilarious movie. There's a lot of really awesome quotes like, bye, buddy, I hope you find your dad. I use that weekly. Just such a great movie, and of course, there is quite a few pops for Elf as well. Batman Begins, that's a pretty good movie as well. I'm going to basically say the same thing for all the Batman movies. I just love all of them. Supernatural, yeah, I've seen like a couple episodes here and there while it was on TV, but I haven't really like gone to actually like watch through it. But of course, you do have to talk about it because it is such a huge fan base. V for Vendetta, one of my favorite movies of all time. I love the movie so much. And of course, with my birthday being November 5th, it really resonates towards me as well because that's the whole date that the movie takes place on. 300, really cool original Funko Pop that we got with Leonidas. And it's basically a Mega Grail at this point. And then we have the new wave, which I don't really think is going to affect that Grail, but 300 is an amazing movie as well. The Big Bang Theory, you either love it or you hate it. Personally, I don't dislike it. I think it's pretty funny most of the time. I like how you can have some of these nerdy jokes on there. Of course, there is Young Sheldon, which is like a spin-off of Sheldon Cooper, of course, when he was younger, which I actually really enjoy that show, maybe even more than The Big Bang Theory. But there's a ton of pops for Big Bang Theory. It's some of the more like OG pops that I remember seeing before I really even knew what Funko was. Then we have The Dark Knight, and like DK said, one of the best DC movies of all time. So good. I mean, with Bane and of course, Heath Ledger, that Joker is amazing. People obviously have their opinions on their favorite Jokers, but I feel like a lot of people can agree that it's Heath Ledger. I mean, so good. The hair is great. Just the mannerisms of the Joker were perfect in that movie. Watchmen, like DK said, super underrated. I love Watchmen as well, and I would love for Funko to make new Watchmen pops with the type of detail they put in their pops nowadays. I think that we can see a lot of really amazing pops, and honestly, I don't really want to pay the huge price tag on a lot of those different pops from that set. Then the Hangover trilogy, So hilarious. I remember watching them like in theaters or like at the drive-in, that same drive-in we talked about with Twister. And yeah, they're hilarious, of course. Dr. Ken Jeong, I would love to see a pop of him down the line for the Hangover set. The Polar Express, I think, is definitely an underrated Christmas movie. It's unlike any other Christmas movie because it's just so much different. The animation style was a little bit creepy, some people say, especially with like the blank kind of expression in the eyes of some of the characters. But what an amazing story and a great movie. I would love to see at least a pop rides for the Polar Express. And then the last one we have here for the 2000s is The Blind Side. And it would be pretty sweet to see pops for that movie as well. I haven't watched that movie in damn near a decade, so I'm definitely going to have to go back and watch it again pretty soon.
All right, so now moving on to the 2010s. So there wasn't really much listed here, unlike the 2000s, but nonetheless, there are some pretty cool ones. First off is both parts 1 and 2 of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, because it was 2010 and then 2011, respectively, for it releasing. The Dark Knight Rises came out in, I believe, 2011, if I'm not mistaken. And then this was also the decade of the beginning of the DC Extended Universe, which I'm not going to mention every single film in the DCEU, considering that it was like a 50-50 of like bangers and like crappy movies. But I am going to mention actually two of my favorite DC movies are actually a part of this at this time. So first off is The Man of Steel, which was the very first one to kick off and is based off Superman. And then the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, which actually is my favorite DCEU film. And then there's also some horror movies at this point, which we have The Conjuring, Annabelle, and It. And then a couple of random films I thought I'd throw in because I feel like some people would definitely want us for some reason to talk about the 2019 Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix. And then I thought I'd add it because it's actually listed in, if you see the like glam shots for the Funko Pops or Warner Brothers 100, there's a lot of movie titles that are listed in the background. And this one is listed, so I thought it'd be funny to kind of talk about it. That's the movie A Star is Born. So starting off with the Harry Potter Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, this was actually the first movie that created the concept of let's divide it into two because you're going to make a ton of money in the box office. And so when they did the Deathly Hallows Part 1, yeah, you knew you were going to end off on a cliffhanger, but then you made so much more money the year after when Part 2 came out. And then you've seen that with so many movies. The Dark Knight Rises, I do want to mention because you mentioned about Bane. This is the movie, I believe, where Bane makes an appearance and not the Dark Knight. And I remember watching this movie and I thought this was really cool. Tom Hardy as Bane. And then later on, we'd see him in Venom for the Marvel movies. But nonetheless, I mean, really cool movie. Also, don't think it's as good as The Dark Knight, but nonetheless, Dark Knight Rises was cool. Man of Steel, what a wicked Superman movie. Henry Cavill as Superman, and this is like, he's up there with Christopher Reeves as like the best Superman. And Man of Steel, what a great movie, and was a great way to kick off the DCEU to see like how promising it could have been. And then I guess I'll mention about Wonder Woman from 2017. This was a movie that I didn't expect to be as great as it was. And then it's now to this day my favorite DCEU film. It's so good. And I feel like not a lot of people talk about it as one of their best DCEU movies in their opinion. And then talking about the horror movies all in a row, Conjuring, Annabelle, and It. The Conjuring is a great series of movies. We actually just got the first Funko Pop as terms to the Warner Brothers horror series set for the NFTs. And at this point is out now as a physical redeemable. And then Annabelle, there's a few pops for that. 2017 It movie, Funko made so many pops of it. Like there's so many pops, so many Pennywises, so many like Georgies. And then one that I could think of off the top of my head that they did very well was literally the scene, obviously, where Georgie is trying to get the paper boat from the sewer from Pennywise. They did that very well. Now, I guess I'm going to talk about the 2019 Joker movie. Joaquin Phoenix did a pretty great job as Joker. I don't know if I would say he is better than Jack Nicholson, but I don't think he's as better as Heath Ledger. I think he's either number 2 or 3 in my opinion if I were to rank my Jokers properly. But nonetheless, that was a pretty crazy version of the Joker. And if you have not seen it yet, you definitely should, because it's a very darker Joker than what we've normally seen in prior years. And then A Star is Born, I've actually watched that quite a bit of times. It's actually a pretty good movie. Lady Gaga, I believe, is the main girl. And then you have Bradley Cooper. And then you have the Shallow Hallows song that I actually have on my Spotify playlist for some reason. It's actually a pretty catchy song.
All right, so talking about Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Part 2, those are the two movies that I haven't seen, so I don't really have a lot to talk about with them, but they do look really good from what I've seen of, like, let's say clips or like the trailers, how it's a little bit darker than you see with the first Harry Potter movies. The Dark Knight Rises, and of course, yeah, I was thinking that The Dark Knight Rises was grouped in with The Dark Knight when we were talking about the 2000s movies, but of course, being 2011, I think it is, that this makes more sense. So yeah, now I'll talk about Bane more. Yeah, Bane was awesome. I remember we watched this. Me and DK were in Comtech class, I remember, and our teacher had put on The Dark Knight Rises. So that's the first time I watched The Dark Knight Rises. That was really cool to watch it, basically while we were in school. Superman, Man of Steel, great movie as well. This Superman is really cool, and I definitely have to go back and watch some of the Superman movies because I really enjoyed them, and I don't know why I haven't like taken the time to re-enjoy those. The Conjuring and Annabelle, haven't watched those because I don't watch a ton of scary movies, but Annabelle is a really interesting story. Wonder Woman, I actually haven't seen any of the Wonder Woman films, so I definitely do have to watch those. Never got the chance to watch them in theaters. The new It movie, I have seen about, I would say maybe half an hour of that movie. My mom was watching it one night, so I kind of sat down and watched some of it while I was talking to her. And yeah, of course, Funko has made a million pops of Pennywise from this version of it. Just insane. Then Joker, I have watched, and it's a lot different than like any other Joker that you ever see. So I don't know if I'd even put them in the same like grouping, but of course, Joaquin Phoenix killed it with this movie. It was so good. And then, of course, A Star is Born. I actually haven't watched that movie, so I will definitely have to watch that because I'm actually a huge fan of Lady Gaga.
And now the current decade that we're in, because who knows, maybe someone in the year of 2030 to 2039 may be listening to this podcast. We have the 2020s. And of course, there's not really a lot to name here. It's mainly basically the DCEU films for the most part. Zack Snyder's Justice League, The Suicide Squad, The Batman, The Flash, and then because it is a Warner Brothers property, and I thought I'd mention it, is the Barbie movie. Zack Snyder's Justice League. So I didn't mention the Justice League, or as people call it, the Justice League, in the 2010s because it was basically dog. And a lot of people would agree if you're a huge DC fan, and Zack Snyder, who had originally directed it, but then he couldn't really commit to filming it because the unfortunate passing of his daughter. So he needed to take time off. And then Joss Whedon had to direct the rest of the film. And they pretty much like scrapped everything that Zack Snyder had done. But then there was this huge trend on social media, like, let's get Zack Snyder's Justice League. Let's see that. So they made Zack Snyder's Justice League in his vision as its own movie. And people really enjoyed that much more. The Suicide Squad, I actually liked it much more than Suicide Squad from 2016. Pretty decent movie. And then that led to, of course, I guess I'll mention it for the 2020s because it was enjoyable. I didn't even think about this, is the Peacemaker series. So that was a really cool show. The Batman, I have not seen yet, the one with Robert Pattinson as Batman. I've heard nothing but good things. And although right now I'm not enjoying what the Riddler looks like in that movie, as terms to like we've seen the Funko Pops that were made, and it's like, oh, that's what Riddler looks like when you think of like growing up with Jim Carrey as your Riddler. I'll have to watch it though, so I can't really judge it based off of what I've seen thus far. The Flash I haven't seen yet, but of course there was backlash because of the actor who had played the Flash. A little bit of controversy is caused outside of movies, like caused a lot of people not to watch that movie, even though it was so jam-packed. You had Michael Keaton return as Batman. Ben Affleck was Batman there, so you had a bunch of Batmans. And then the guy who had played General Zod in Man of Steel made an appearance in that movie, which really shocked me. I think that's one of the driving points of me wanting to watch that, because I enjoyed the Man of Steel so much and General Zod in that movie, that the fact that he's in this movie is like really intriguing. And then I kind of want to see the interaction with the two Batmans, which if you've seen that, don't comment anything because I haven't seen it, and I'm sure MD hasn't seen it either. And then Barbie, I've heard nothing but good things, even though I never went to go see it in the theaters, and I'm not sure the likeliness of when I will see Barbie, but nonetheless, I think I will see it at some point because I've heard nothing but good things. And from what I've seen, it does seem pretty cool, especially from what I'm hearing. John Cena makes an appearance as like a merman Barbie in the movie.
So for Warner Bros. In 2020 or the 2020s, I'm gonna make this short and simple. I haven't seen any of these movies. I did plan on seeing the Barbie movie in theaters, never ended up getting the time to do so. Zack Snyder's Justice League, I've been really meaning to watch that because I've heard pretty good things about it and how long it is as well, and just really great. The Suicide Squad, I've heard pretty good things about as well. That's probably a little bit lower on my list, though. The Batman is probably top tier on my list. My one coworker went to go see it in theaters and he said it was amazing. And same goes with The Flash. I never got around to it, but I was super pumped for it. And I actually kind of did plan on watching it. Me and another coworker had kind of talked about going to see it, but we never got around to it. So it's not like I don't want to watch these movies. I just really have not got around to it yet. But of course, we have seen a ton of Funko Pops for every single one of these movies, and I'm going to have to check them out.
All right, so like every fandom related podcast that we do, we always like to mention Funko Pops that we want to see next. Of course, just like the Disney one, we have listed either a pop or a set of pops that maybe we want to see again or has never had Funko Pops and we just want to see be made into Funko Pops.
All right, so making this list, I made it pretty obscure. There's some things on here that who knows if we'll see ever. Most of them are sets, but there are a couple, I believe, that is just one pop, and I feel like that's all you really need. And I will say that every single set or single pop on here has never had like a Funko Pop before. Let's get right to it with the first set of pops, and I have the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. How have we not seen Fresh Prince pops? It blows my mind. It really just does not make sense because it was such a huge TV show. Will Smith is still doing stuff and stirring up controversy sometimes too. But I have a set of basically 4 pops. I think this could easily be like 7 pops in this original wave, but I've just narrowed it down to the 4 that I'd like to see the most. Of course, Will, you got Carlton. He'd probably be in the pose of doing the Carlton as well. Uncle Phil, I think you have to add in this set. And then the last pop to end off this set would be Jeffrey the Butler. I feel like that'd be like one of the pops besides maybe Will, where if you see it out of the box, you'd be like, oh, that's Jeffrey. Like, it's just such a classic look for him.
Fact that I didn't write that in this list is mind-blowing. And I bet you so many people listening to this right now are thinking, why didn't you mention Fresh Prince? But yeah, good thing you mentioned it now.
Moving on to the second set of pops is for one of my favorite movies of all time. And I was actually surprised to see that this was a Warner Bros. Picture. And that is my favorite Adam Sandler movie of all time, Little Nicky. Amazing movie. I know a lot of people like don't regard it as one of their favorite Adam Sandler movies, which I think is crazy because I think it is hilarious and the characters are amazing. The cast is wild for the movie as well. So the pops that I have listed down are, of course, Nicky. Would have to have that classic Nicky where he's wearing the blue like puffy jacket, maybe the orange glove. Mr. Beefy, the dog, I think would be a hilarious pop. Of course, you could get away with doing a pop and buddy version, but I would like to see it as a standalone pop. Then we have the Gatekeeper. I think that this would be so funny. I forget what the actor's name is who played the Gatekeeper. He was in Weeds, but that's basically the character who ends up getting like the boobs on his head, which is just hilarious. And of course, that would be the version you'd have to see for the Funko Pop itself. Then we have Adrian, which is one of the brothers. I think that of the brothers, if they're going to do one, it has to be Adrian. And then the last pop that I have on here is basically one where they could just do this pop and I'd be satisfied with it. And that'd be a Popeyes exclusive. Nicky with the Popeyes chicken. You could even have it be a deluxe pop where he's sitting on the bench.
Popeyes chicken is fucking awesome. Yeah, I was going to actually mention, if you didn't mention, if there was a Popeyes exclusive pop on your list, but that's the last one. Mr. Beefy, you need to be a Funko Pop. Anyways, let's see what the rest of your Warner Brothers wish list is.
So the next pop that I have on here is one singular pop. There could probably be about 3 or 4 in this wave, but I honestly think we only need one, and I think it should be like a con exclusive, and that is for Osmosis Jones, the character being Osmosis Jones himself. That would be amazing. I feel like a lot of people are wanting to see an Osmosis Jones, and when I'm thinking of 90s or early 2000s, like Warner Brothers animated movies or shows, Osmosis Jones is definitely at the top of the things that I think about. So I'm really surprised Funko hasn't done an Osmosis Jones. It would be awesome to see like a Bill Murray pop. Of course, we've seen a bunch of Bill Murray pops, and generally with Bill Murray pops, you can tell that it's him. So I think that they could do it like that, but I don't think you really need it. I think you just need a standalone Osmosis Jones. Then the next set of pops that I have is actually, again, just one Funko Pop because I think you really only need one, and that is for the Never Ending Story. And the pop is, of course, Atreyu riding on Falkor, and of course, Falkor has to be flocked and he has to be massive. This has to be one of those pops where it's a box that we've never seen, like a box size we've never seen, like a long box with Atreyu, of course, in normal pop form, and then just a massive Falkor in pop form. Throw the flocking on there, make it an exclusive. I don't care. We need to see it. How have we not seen at least a Falkor pop at this point? Blows my mind.
Never ending story. Yeah. Needs pops. Let's get it. Flock pop. Let's go.
And then moving on to my last set of pops here. Again, this is one that could have a ton of different pops, and that's for the mask. How we haven't seen mask pops, I don't know. People make customs all the time. You see them on the internet. The mask is huge. People love it. It's Jim Carrey, and Funko needs to get on that. So the pops that I have for this set are Stanley with the mask, basically in his human form, and then he's holding the mask itself, the wooden mask. I think that would be a really cool pop. And then I have Stanley, I guess would still be his name. I don't think his name is the mask when he has the mask on. Basically him in the yellow suit, wearing the hat with the feather on it. And then, of course, have a chase version where he does not have the hat on, where you can see his bald head. And then, of course, you can throw other pops in there. You can have one where he has a cigarette for the whole smoking, or the one where like he's got his eyes out and his jaw's like way dropped, like a human wouldn't be able to do. There's a lot of different things that they could do with the mask, like I was saying, with like Son of the Mask, the animated show of the mask. There's a ton of different pops that could be done if they pick the license up for the mask.
This one is so weird to talk about because for years there has been a lot of like retailers that were like, oh, there are mask pops coming out, and they were like in the systems. So it was almost like that whole story about a long time ago when you would see, let's say, oh, you can pre-order an M&M pop, or for the longest time when they had the Snoop Dogg pops for years, and it's like, okay, I guess it's never going to happen, and then it finally made. That's kind of the same situation with the mask. So for my list, it's actually kind of the opposite of what MD mentioned. He mentioned everything that like has never been made to pops. Mine has been made to pops, and either I'm going to see new ones or something expanded to that. So the first one I have here is an Iron Giant pop movie posters. I think that would be pretty cool because I want to see something as terms to the Iron Giant back into Funko Pop form. And I'm not sure if they would go down the route of like the Iron Giant as a pop itself, because maybe what would you do that hasn't been done realistically? So I think the movie poster would be cool. And the movie poster I'm thinking of, you see him flying in the air and he has the human in his hand, because you have regular Iron Giant, and then there was the Iron Giant with the cars, in terms of the Funko Pops that were 4-inch. This one, I think a lot of people have been requesting for a long time, and I don't know how it hasn't happened yet, is Space Jam Michael Jordan. Where is a Space Jam Michael Jordan pop? You make Michael Jordan with a Red Bulls, White Bulls jersey, a Black Bulls jersey, the All-Stars jersey, the Team USA jersey. Where is Space Jam jersey Michael Jordan? It's gotta happen at some point soon. And then the next pop I have listed is Nurse Joker from The Dark Knight. That would be a wicked pop. People have been wanting this for a while. We all thought that possibly this was going to be one of the redeemables for the Funko NFTs, and then they just never ended up adding Joker to that lineup. And then I kind of teased this earlier, I want to see a new wave of Watchmen pop. I want to see a huge lineup for Watchmen where you have more than just Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan, but still make remakes of those so that it's more affordable and they're more detailed to today's standards, unlike the original pops made in like 2012, 2013. And then last but not least, I mentioned about this, and I've actually mentioned this for years, we need Outsiders Funko Pops. Like, there is an endless possibility of Outsiders. I mean, you can have, of course, Pony Boy, you got Dally, Ralph Macchio's characters, was it Johnny, I think it is? I can't exactly remember the names for some reason, but one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's been on like literally like when I first started collecting Funko Pops, I wrote like a top 10 wish list of what I want to see. That list included like Green Day and Trailer Park Boys that I've easily checked off at this point, but one of those ones that I wrote down that technically has not been checked off is the Outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, all of those are really good. The Nurse Joker would be hilarious. I would love to see that in Funko Pop form. And of course, the Outsiders, I would definitely be picking up every member of the Greasers as well. They would be so cool. I feel like they could do a good job of having them look like what they look like in the movie. Of course, they are human characters, so you can fall into that thing where you do have these characters that don't really look too different from each other. But I feel with the Greasers, you could get the job done, even though every single character are very similar to each other in that movie when it comes to looks, at least.
Anyways, guys, that is going to be the end of this edition of a Funko Podcast. And if you enjoyed this special Warner Brothers edition of a Funko Podcast, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your favorite Warner Brothers properties, whether it's TV shows or movies. And we hope to see you guys on another edition of a Funko Podcast. 1, 2, 3. I'm out of here.
Alrighty then. Peace in, peace out.